The new iPhone Air is the thinnest phone Apple has ever produced. But has that required too many compromises? That's what I'll be taking a closer look at in this video. The last time Apple had a really thin phone with a large screen was back in 2014 when they launched the iPhone 6 Plus. Unfortunately, it had the problem that it would bend if you sat on it. It could easily be bent with just your bare hands. And even though it was pretty thin and had a bigger screen than previous iPhones, it still doesn't come close to the iPhone Air. For example, the 6 Plus had a 5.5-inch screen, whereas the Air's is 6.5 inches. And even though the iPhone 6 Plus was thin, the iPhone Air is actually 21% thinner. Fortunately, Apple has learned from their mistakes, and that's why they've done some pretty intense bend tests on the iPhone Air to make sure the phone doesn't bend. Or actually, it can bend, but it returns to its original shape. As I mentioned in my unboxing video, there would probably also be various YouTubers who tested the phone's durability, and fortunately, it seems that everyone agrees that the iPhone Air actually lives up to Apple's claim that it's their most durable iPhone to date. However, in order to make the phone as thin as possible while still keeping it durable, Apple has had to compromise on a number of other elements. It only has one camera. It only has one speaker, and it has the smallest battery of all the new iPhones. On the other hand, it has the same A19 Pro chip as this year's most expensive phones. It also has 12 gigabytes of RAM just like the Pro phones, and it features both the action button and the camera control button that all phones got last year. On the other hand, the USB-C connection is, strangely enough, still the more than 20-year-old and very slow USB 2.0 standard. But what does that actually mean in practice? Let's start with the battery life. It's actually impossible to create a test that gives an accurate picture in relation to your own personal needs, because there are so many different variables at play. Which mobile network do you use? How much are you on Wi-Fi during the day? Which apps do you use? And how many notifications do you get, for example, on a typical day? We all use our phones differently, so battery life can vary greatly from user to user. You can also see this in the tests you find on YouTube, where the results vary quite a bit. Some show that the iPhone Air achieves almost the same battery life as the iPhone 17, while others show that it performs much worse. How many hours the phone can run also varies a lot from test to test, which really emphasizes that it's the usage pattern that matters. In general, though, it seems that the battery life isn't quite as bad as many had feared when they first saw the phone. But on the other hand, it's not fantastic either. I would say that if you're coming from one of the larger phones like the Plus or Pro Max models, you'll definitely experience significantly worse battery life with the iPhone Air. But if you're coming from one of the other models, the iPhone Air will probably deliver about the same battery life as you're used to. Neither worse nor better. One of the things that uses the phone's battery is the processor, which surprisingly is the same as in this year's Pro phones, though with one less GPU core. In practice, that's not something you'll notice unless you often play games with demanding graphics. That's one of the few things that can push the processor to its limits. In those cases, however, there's another factor at play: temperature. When a processor is working, it gets hot, and the more processing power you use, the higher the temperature gets. If it gets too high, the processor has to reduce its performance to avoid overheating. What is also known as throttling. Because of the very thin design and a glass back, which isn't particularly good at conducting heat, many people were therefore quite surprised that the iPhone Air got the same processor as the Pro phones, which this year has both received a brand new aluminium chassis and a so-called vapor chamber specifically designed to cool the new processor. To see how big the difference in performance is, I ran the benchmark test called 3D Mark Solar Bay. It's a stress test that continuously puts a load on the phone's processor for 20 minutes, specifically to reveal whether performance drops as the processor gets warmer. And here it's very clear that the iPhone Air is not built to utilize the processor to the same extent as the iPhone 17 Pro. If you test the phones in the app called Geekbench, which measures the processor's maximum performance, you might otherwise think that there isn't much of a difference. In the CPU test, they're very close. And in the GPU test, the 17 Pro scores about 20% higher due to its extra GPU core. No surprises here, but the stress test shows something different. The test runs the same 1-minute loop 20 times, And while the iPhone 17 Pro's score drops relatively slowly over the course of the test, the iPhone Air drops to the lowest score already after the first loop and stays there. If you look at the first and last loop, you can see that the iPhone Air actually throttles its performance down to the minimum already halfway through the first loop, and it never recovers. And even though the iPhone 17 Pro's last loop is lower than the first, it's still higher than the iPhone Air's lowest level, which is reached after just 40 seconds. That tells us two things. First, it shows that the iPhone 17 Pro's new design with aluminium and a vapor chamber specifically designed for cooling actually works. And that the iPhone Air is not built for continuous performance. Because even though the processor is technically just as fast as the one in this year's Pro phones, it can only deliver that high performance for a relatively short time. This means that the phone will normally perform just as quickly as Apple's Pro models, but when it comes to longer-lasting and more demanding tasks, it won't be able to keep up. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just one of the compromises Apple has made to be able to produce the thin phone. Most people will experience the same great performance as in the Pro phones, as long as they're not power users or, for example, playing graphically demanding games on the phone. As mentioned, the screen on the iPhone Air is 6.5 inches, which is right between the iPhone 17 Pro Max and the Plus models from recent years, all of which have a 6.7-inch screen, and the iPhone 17 and 17 Pro, both of which have a 6.3-inch screen. So you could say that the screen is a compromise compared to the largest iPhones, but fortunately that's also the only compromise in that regard. It's actually the same OLED screen found on all the new phones, with 120 Hz ProMotion and a brightness that goes all the way up to 3000 nits in bright sunlight. But even though a jump from 2000 to 3000 might sound like a lot, there actually isn't a huge difference between, for example, the iPhone 16 Pro and the iPhone Air. It's still an improvement though, and the new screen is excellent. Just like all the other new phones, it also supports always on, so it can display information even when the phone is in standby mode. The screen is now also protected by Ceramic Shield 2, which is supposed to be more resistant to scratches, and that's actually quite noticeable. The YouTube channel Jerry Rig Everything always tests the new iPhone screens by scratching them with tools calibrated to different hardness levels. And while all iPhones in recent years have shown light scratches at level 6 with deeper grooves at level 7, the new iPhones have actually moved up a notch, so now you have to go all the way to level 8 to make a deep scratch on the screen. And the screen has also received a new anti-reflective coating, which is supposed to reduce glare compared to previous models. And there is indeed a difference compared to my iPhone 16 Pro, but only a slight one. At the top of the screen sits the selfie camera, and this is yet another area where Apple hasn't compromised on the iPhone Air. It's actually the same one that's in all the other new phones. And that's a good thing because the selfie camera in particular has received a serious upgrade this year. For the past 6 years, it has had the same resolution of 12 megapixels, but this year we've finally gotten a new sensor that delivers images at 18 megapixels. The sensor itself is 24 megapixels, but for the first time it's square, which means it can deliver 18 megapixel images in both orientations. So you can take both portrait and landscape photos without rotating the phone. You can switch between the two formats on the screen, and the images have the same resolution no matter which one you choose. You can also enable automatic zoom and rotation, so the phone itself keeps track of how many people are in front of the camera and adjusts the framing to include everyone. However, you should be aware that to use the automatic zoom, the camera starts with a tighter crop, and in this case, you only get a 7 megapixel image. You only get the full 18 megapixels with the widest crop. However, the same thing happens on the iPhone 16 Pro, where you also have 2 crop options. Here as well, only the widest crop gives you 12 megapixels. The tighter crop on the iPhone 16 Pro also gives you a 7 megapixel image, just like on the iPhone Air, but there are still far more details in the photos from the new iPhones. Here you can see the narrow crop, which gives a 7 megapixel image on both phones. If we zoom into 400%, it's pretty clear that the iPhone Air captures much finer details. For example, look at the pores in my skin. Here you can see both phones at their widest crop, and as you can see, you get more in the frame with the iPhone Air. As mentioned, the phone delivers an 18 megapixel image here, whereas all previous phones only give you 12 megapixels. If we zoom in to 400% on the photo from the iPhone 16 Pro, we therefore have to zoom in to 500% on the iPhone Air to get the same crop, but even though we're zooming in 20% more, the image is still sharper and has more details. A clear improvement. Another thing that is also supposed to be significantly improved is the image stabilization when recording video with the selfie camera. And that is indeed correct. Just look at the rooftops in the background here. They're bouncing and shaking on the iPhone 16 Pro, but not on the iPhone Air. And as I mentioned, on the iPhone Air, I can also switch to widescreen video without having to turn the phone and still get full 4K video output. So no matter which iPhone you're upgrading from, you'll get a significantly better selfie camera in the iPhone Air. If we turn the phone around, we come to one of the biggest compromises compared to the other phones, namely the rear camera. Here, as you can see, there's only a single camera, and that gives you quite a few limitations compared to both the iPhone 17 and especially the iPhone 17 Pro. The camera is the same as the main camera in the iPhone 17. This means it has a 48 megapixel sensor that by default delivers images at a resolution of 24 megapixels because the camera, just like in last year's phones, combines a 48 megapixel image with a 12 megapixel image to get the detail from the 48 megapixels along with the light sensitivity from the 12, which merges several individual pixels on the sensor. It works really well, and it gives you better photos than you can get on phones without this feature. So if you're coming from an iPhone 14 or older, you'll notice a clear improvement in image resolution. The 48 megapixels also make it possible to have 2x zoom in what Apple calls optical quality. Here, the camera uses the central 12 megapixels on the sensor to zoom in on the image. In practice, it's a digital crop, but Apple does some tricks in their image pipeline so the quality is higher than if you manually crop the image afterward. You should be aware that photos taken with 2x zoom are not 24 megapixels but only 12, but that's the same on both the iPhone 17 and 17 Pro. You can also zoom in further, up to 10 times in photo mode and up to 6 times when recording video. But then the quality drops quite drastically. It's the same on the regular iPhone 17, but here you also have an ultra-wide lens, which gives you a wider crop and the ability to take macro photos and macro videos. Here you can see a photo taken without zooming in on the iPhone Air and the iPhone 17 Pro. The camera on the Air has what corresponds to a 26mm crop, just like the iPhone 17, while the 17 Pro has a slightly wider crop, equivalent to 24mm, but otherwise the quality is pretty much the same at first glance. If we zoom in to 400%, it looks like the iPhone Air might add a little bit more sharpening to the image, as you can see in the leaves on the tree. I've also taken some photos with the camera in night mode, and here the iPhone 17 Pro's better sensor provides a bit more detail in the very dark areas, but overall, there isn't a huge difference in the picture as a whole. The conclusion is that as long as you only use 1x or 2x zoom, you don't lose much by choosing the iPhone Air. However, you do if you want to make other crops. Here you can again see the 1x crop on both the iPhone Air and the iPhone 17 Pro. But because the 17 Pro has an ultra-wide-angle lens, I can also get a much wider crop, which isn't possible on the iPhone Air. And if I zoom in more than 3 times, there's also a huge difference. The iPhone 17 Pro has a 4x optical zoom, and you can really tell. At 2 and 3 times zoom, both cameras still use the primary lens, which is cropped digitally. So there's not much difference there. But as soon as we hit 4x, the iPhone 17 Pro switches to its optical telephoto lens, and then the difference is clear. And it only becomes more obvious the more you zoom in. At 8x, the quality on the iPhone Air is really poor, while the iPhone 17 Pro still delivers a good image thanks to the new 48 megapixel sensor behind the telephoto lens. The phone actually does this even at 10x, which is the iPhone Air's maximum zoom range, and even at 40x, which is the maximum digital zoom on the iPhone 17 Pro, the quality is surprisingly still better than the maximum digital zoom on the iPhone Air. This means that with the iPhone Air, you can't take photos with an extra wide crop, and if you need to zoom in on your subject more than 2 or 3 times, the iPhone 17 Pro is a much better solution. This is also evident when recording video. As mentioned, the iPhone Air can digitally zoom up to 6 times, while the iPhone 17 Pro can zoom up to 24 times, so again, you can get much closer to what you're filming. Personally, I think that's quite a big compromise. But if you've never needed a telephoto lens, then maybe it's a compromise you're willing to accept. Just keep that in mind on the day you're sitting out at the soccer field and your kid is running around way out there and you want to get him in the shot. Besides the telephoto lens, as mentioned, you also lose the ultra-wide-angle lens on the iPhone Air, and that's another compromise you should be aware of. The ultra-wide-angle lens has actually been on all phones except the SE models ever since the iPhone 11, so there's a good chance it's also on your current phone. So here you need to consider how often you use it. Maybe it's more often than you think. If you have an iPhone 13 Pro or newer or an iPhone 16, the ultra-wide-angle lens also lets you take macro photos and macro videos. Maybe it's not something you use as often, but it's still a feature you'll lose with the iPhone Air. Fortunately, it looks like portrait mode still works well on the iPhone Air, even though it now uses AI instead of two cameras or the phone's LiDAR sensor to calculate artificial depth of field. Something that typically challenges portrait mode photos are gaps, like the handle of the mug in this picture or the space between the candlesticks. But here, the iPhone Air actually performs just as well as the 17 Pro. On the other hand, you can't record video with shallow depth of field. That's what Apple calls cinematic mode. And you also can't record 3D video since both require two cameras. And then there are the speakers. Here too there's a compromise because, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's only one. The one at the top, which you also use when you're talking on the phone. This means you don't get as good sound from the iPhone Air as you do from the other phones. It's obvious that you can't get stereo sound, but the actual sound quality is also noticeably worse on the iPhone Air compared to, for example, the iPhone 17 Pro. So if you often listen to, for example, podcasts or other things through the phone's built-in speakers, that's also a compromise you need to be aware of. But do all these compromises mean that you should skip the iPhone Air? Not necessarily, you just need to be aware of what you're giving up. I think you pay a high price to get a thin phone. The iPhone Air costs €250 more than the iPhone 17, and the only real extras you get are a 0.2-inch larger screen, a thinner body, and a weight reduction of 12 grams. Of course, you also get the extra 4 gigabytes of RAM and the A19 Pro processor, but that's not something you'll notice during normal use. On the other hand, you lose both a camera and a speaker, so you can't take wide-angle or macro photos, and you also miss out on macro, cinematic, or 3D video. And if you play audio from the phone, it's in mono and lower quality, plus you get worse battery life. The iPhone Air also can't charge as quickly as the iPhone 17 and 17 Pro. With the right charger, both can add a 50% charge to the battery in just 20 minutes, whereas the iPhone Air needs 30 minutes, and it only comes with eSIM, so you can't transfer your physical SIM card to the phone. For just €100 more, you can get the iPhone 17 Pro, which does have a slightly smaller screen and is much thicker, but on the other hand, doesn't compromise on anything and lets you get much closer to what you're filming or photographing. So what you should choose depends on what you prioritize most. With the iPhone Air, you get a super light and thin phone that feels very premium. So if you care more about design and feel than camera and performance, then the Air might be the phone for you. But if not, then you should look at either the iPhone 17 or the iPhone 17 Pro. And speaking of the 17 Pro, I'll be reviewing it in my next video, which you can watch right there. Otherwise, I just hope that you feel like subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. And if you'd like to support my videos directly, I'm always happy to receive a cup of coffee. See you soon.